Welcome to another episode of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Shane Green. I will tell you all about Shane in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is a show that poses questions to thought leaders and doers like Shane, whose ideas and actions are helping us come to a greater understanding of ourselves. Grace Under Pressure reveals what is too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the connecting, and the commitment we feel toward others. Grace for me is generosity, respect, and compassion. And when you do it as a leader, especially during challenging times, it requires the ability to act for the benefit of others and energize the team. So welcome, Shane.
Buddy, how are you? This is a long time coming. Very excited.
Great. Well, Shane is joining us from the North Island of New Zealand, live, if I'm not mistaken. So,
correct. Again, it's a real place down here.
That's great. I will. Let me tell you, folks, about you. You are a world-renowned keynote speaker. At least you used to be when we had keynote live speakers. But you're the author of Culture Hacker. You're a television personality and a much-in-demand business consultant with global business clients. Okay, you cut your teeth at the Ritz-Carlton. You've worked in multiple industries to transform employee mindsets, habits, and skills. You're the president and founder of SGEI, a team of lead a team of branding professionals, and you've worked with companies that maybe people have heard of, like the NBA, Madison Square Garden, Westfield, Foot Locker, NetJets, United Airlines, and BMW. So, wow, what a pleasure to have you with us today, Shane. Thank you.
Thank you, John. As I said, excited to be here.
Yeah, great. Well,
even if being here is the other side of the world right now.
Well, I know a lot of my friends would happily trade places with you right now. So,
yes.
Yeah. Anyway, tell us a little bit about your journey as a thought leader from New Zealand to the U.S. and now and back again.
Yeah, I guess we've come full circle. So again, like every other New Zealander, the world doesn't know this, but when you turn 21 as a Kiwi, finish your university degree, they actually kick you out of the country. Not really, but the idea is that you're meant to go travel the world. So most New Zealanders go on their big OE. You go to different places around the world, you work. The idea or theory is that you do 3 or 4 years and then you come back home, share all that great knowledge, and you settle down for the rest of the life. I went to the US. I was fortunate to work with the Ritz-Carlton, so I got to work throughout Asia. I then started my own business in the US, and even though I'm sitting here in New Zealand today, our business is doing well there in Las Vegas, Nevada. So for the last 28 years, we've sort of been setting up in the United States. In the last 15 years, we started out being really focused on the training business, customer service training. And then as we started to get into the space of working with supervisors, managers, executives, we really started to shift into the customer experience space, which I think is interesting. Customer service into customer experience. And really, in the last 5 years, as we were doing a lot of customer experience journey mapping, helping organizations improve what the customer's experience looked like, we realized there was something really lacking in the culture, in the employee experience space. You know, a lot of companies invest heavily in their customer experience strategy. And what was always amazing to us is they weren't investing in their employee experience strategy, which is take care of your employees, let them take care of the customers. So for the last 5 years, we've really been focused in that space. As a result, I wrote the book about culture hacking, which is about how to establish the type of employee experience that will create raving fans in your company, as it were. And as I said, we really have been quite fortunate to play into that space where we now look not only at the customer experience, but the employee experience and how to ultimately drive that to a higher level. The coming back to New Zealand, I don't think was business related. I think it was more society based right now, where we took advantage of an opportunity to bring our family down here and enjoy a safe environment.
Yes, and you told me that your children are schooling virtually from New Zealand back home, correct?
That is correct. They're amazing. They're getting up at 3 every morning, much earlier than I. It's on them. Talk about building some resilience. I think this might be a good life skill that we're getting into. So I'm all for it.
Oh, that's great. One of the key concepts, I think, and it's another E word when we talk about customer experience, and that it's engagement, which cuts both ways. With you can't engage your customers unless you engage your employees, and I think that's one of the things that you explore and work in. Am I correct? So
Yeah, that's really important because I think the word engagement gets kind of lost a little. We've really done a lot of work in studying employee engagement. So the word engagement is really critical because it's really your employees' interest and involvement in helping your business get better. That's really, if you look at the traditional definition, employee engagement. Do your employees help you want to get better? So we always focused on the idea, are your employees helping you get better with your customer, driving revenues, managing expenses? The problem with that idea, because it does work, is that to get people engaged, to get them interested, you actually have to share information with them. So a lot of organizations are still very tight with their information, and I often say, again, the whole idea of sharing information, how can they help you get your goals if they don't know what the goals are, if they don't know what the scores are, and if they're not involved in the process of process improvement? So I think it's very interesting that when we looked at customer engagement, how interested and involved are they in your success? It translates today as, are they an active participant and advocate for your organization? And the same is happening for your associates. Are they the advocate? Are they bringing people in? Are they creating the type of culture ultimately that other people want to join?
That's great. So, where are we now with experience and customers and engagement now that we're all in disparate locations? So, what are we dealing with now? So,
Yeah, I think it's what it is that we have to relook at how to engage. Very early on in the virus, we were doing sort of some various consulting with different organizations. And obviously, we do a lot in the hospitality space. We were working with a sort of retail group, and they were really frustrated because obviously they didn't have customers coming through their doors. And so we had to turn it to the cycle and sort of said, well, wait up, they're still your customers. What are you doing to go out and engage with them? And I think what we saw early on is that successful organizations did one thing very simply and basically. They checked in with their customers and said, how are you doing? And in fact, that was the same strategy we used with a lot of our employees. Everyone was sort of extremely sort of unsettled, particularly at the start of the crisis. And in some ways, I hate using the word the new norm, but people have started to find some cadence and routine in what we're dealing with. But back then, the most basic understanding was, don't wait for people to come to you. So go to your customer and say, how are you doing? Show the humanity and grace that you often talk about by making sure that they are okay. That's the first step of reaffirming our relationship. Then what happens is, again, once you have the relationships, whether it's your customers or your employees, they now can be part of the solution, which means we could then go to our customers and say, how can we help you? What are you needing right now? What part can we play in helping you get through this? And what organizations needed to sort of say, and something you talk about a lot, is we had a generous spirit, which is, at this point, we may not be getting our traditional revenues, where business is not as usual, but we actually are still doing business, even if we might be doing things that are outside our comfort zone, connecting our customers with new people, different suppliers, and maybe even performing a different role. But the idea is that we had to look and go, just because the customers aren't in a traditional buying sense, it doesn't mean they're still not your customers. And more importantly, it doesn't mean you can't do business. It's just different today. So I think there was that unsettling time of, how does business get done? If you actually go back to the basic of that idea of engagement, connect with the relationship. Well, how can I help you? And then you can ask, well, how can we help you? And how can you be involved in helping our business get through this? I think it's a very important basic of that human kindness that doesn't go away.
that's very critical. And then thinking about that is, so what's the state of learning and development? Your two children are going through the learning and development virtually. So what's the state that you deal with a lot of this now virtually? So what's happening on that front, Shane?
Yeah, it's interesting. So right now, I actually wrote an article a couple of months ago in Forbes. I actually spent some time watching my children learn online and go, what could I learn from watching their experience? And again, I got to say, the school that they are involved in had an amazing setup. But obviously, as I watched, what happened was, and again, 12-year-old, 9-year-old, you've got to take it with a grain of salt. But what we saw is, when you have non-live learning, so when the learning is asynchronous, which means it's videos, e-learning, all that, the kids were able to kind of, slacken off. All of a sudden, phones were being used, they were eating. All of a sudden, it was a very different sort of classroom. So that was a very important learning, because what's happening now is everyone's shifting dramatically towards technology-based learning, because that's the solution. It's on demand. What we know is that there's still a place for live learning. So there has to be that interaction. Then what we saw, which was interesting, is when the teachers were live learning, we saw some teachers excel and some struggle. What was the difference? Some were very comfortable with technology, some were not. So again, we've kind of learned that element of it, that again, you can still deliver live learning virtually, in some ways what we're doing right now, but there has to be a level of comfort and confidence, which was always part of the learning process. So the state right now is people are trying to work out, well, what should learning look like in the future? And there's no doubt that technology-based learning is going to be a big part of it. But live learning still has to be mixed in. Why? Because it means I can ask you questions, we can have conversations. We still, and again, I know everybody's got Zoom fatigue, but you can still do breakout sessions. We still do role plays right now. So a lot of the things that we were doing in the live classroom, we've shifted to the virtual classroom. And like what we said with the live classroom, live learning is part of the learning strategy, not the whole learning strategy. So I think that's an important piece. There is still one thing that I'm very passionate, because I do talk a lot about culture, is that you have to have a learning culture. And what is that? Well, culture is about hearts and minds. So when it comes to learning, make it interesting, make it fun, make it engaging. The days of sitting in front of a PowerPoint and being lectured are done, in case someone didn't get the memo, but still we see way too much of that. Yeah. And as a result, like everything in the world, great learning and learning cultures that truly get people excited about what they're invested in and growing and developing hasn't gone away. All we've done is we've had to shift some of the states live to virtual, but we're still seeing some of the same challenges that set out. If you've got a bad learning strategy, again, it's not tied to any goals, outcomes. Again, it's not being led by people that are fun and interactive and the content's outdated. Again, you've still got a problem with learning. So I think the state is just shifting, but it's some of the same problems, but also the same success factors are still there.
Yeah, it's great that it's how easily you have pivoted from live learning. You have a network of facilitators all over the world,
Yep.
Content, your content, and others. But there's something about, and I've talked to colleagues of mine and actually interviewed them, that one of the advantages of virtual learning is the chat, where there can actually get linked in, no pun intended, with
Yep.
More effectively and address individual individual concerns that you might be swept under the rug in a live virtual. Are you seeing any of that, Shane? So.
Yeah, there is some really nice advantage. One is the chat, that as you defined, I think there's a larger comfort level of just sharing ideas. We actually did, we've actually kind of tested a couple of very personal exercises that we were, sometimes you have to be very careful of in the live learning experience of how you're doing it. We've found people much more comfortable to share. We've used the breakout rooms to actually get people from around the world connected together simultaneously. This last week, we did a session where we had employees from the UK in a breakout room with employees from the US and employees from Australia. So we're actually able to cross. That's never happened before. The other thing that people often forget, which I think is really cool, is that we videotape everything now. It used to be that when you did live learning, the production cost and getting the video set up and getting everything. Well, guess what? It's now happening automatically. So we're able to take that, break that video into some small bite-sized chunks, and now we've created really good reinforcement tools, those reinforcement socialization tools. So I'm seeing some positives, and you might know this more than anybody else. Guess what? We're not getting on planes and spending half of our lives in hotel rooms in other cities. We're actually getting to go home each night and sleep in our own bed. So I'm going to put a bit of a shout out for us thought leaders that there is an advantage there as well.
Absolutely. I don't know anybody who's not complaining about that. Except those in the hospitality industry, perhaps.
Well, yes, as I said, Vegas, my hometown, I know is struggling, but like all good things, Vegas will always come back, reinvent itself, and it will be stronger than ever. So we know it'll take a little bit, but we're excited. Always optimistic.
We've touched on this just a little bit, but the enterprise that you've talked about is the Learning Experiences by Design, or LXB. So is that totally virtual now? So
yeah, for right now, I think LXBD, Learning Experiences by Design, it was actually one of the the advent, it was something that I was thinking about for a long time, which was creating a marketplace of content and facilitators that you could have access to, particularly for smaller companies that don't have large learning and design teams. And we're actually playing around with that with a couple of partners and I. Obviously, with what's happened now through the pandemic, the need for virtual learning has gone sort of higher. So live learning certainly is a lot more virtual than it used to. But we even did, in the last week, 3 live classroom sessions. So I think companies are starting to find a bit of a balance. So just keeping that in mind, live is live. And again, whether it's in the classroom or virtual, fairly comfortable. But the fact that we're able to bring, and again, we have a facilitator from the UK that was training in a classroom, I guess, in the US or classrooms across the US 2 weeks ago. So the fact that we're able to bring different accents right now to different countries around the world, I think is kind of cool.
Well, it's not only just the accent, it's the perspective. It's a cultural
Correct.
difference. And which brings me mentioning to, because you are an expert in culture, you wrote Culture Hack. So what do you perceive the impact of pandemic on organizational culture?
Yeah, so here's the piece. So the question is not, do you have a culture? Every company, actually every group, team, actually every family has a culture. Culture by definition is the collective hearts and minds of a group of people. So whenever there's a group of people together, we have a culture. It's how they think and feel about what's going on around them. So with that in mind, we start to think about, well, how has culture been affected? Through the pandemic, hearts and minds got upset. Like any significant change, people are very unsettled. What the focus has been very early in the pandemic as we were looking at different companies we worked with is we had to settle the hearts and minds. I gave the example a little earlier, checking in. One of the things a large hospitality group in Las Vegas did is that while all their employees were on furlough or being paid, but they were sitting at home, what they did is they assigned a manager, a group of 30 employees, and then they just called them each week and says, the first week, how are you doing? And they just talked about how you're doing. Then the second week, they focused in and they talked about what are you most looking forward to getting back to work. The third week, they said, hey, we're going to be back at some point. Start giving me some ideas about how to improve our business. That's that engagement that I talked about. So there was a really nice progressive. So what happened is we really focused in on making the hearts and minds feel good about what they did and who they did it for, remembering they were still sitting at home dealing with a lot of other stresses from outside of that. And those stresses are still going on. So when I come back to culture, what I talk about organizations is that culture is not about the keg parties. It's not about all the big celebrations, the big rewards and employee of the month. It's about how your people feel. And that hasn't changed, which means the organizations that have great cultures always checked in on their employees. They always had managers that connected and made sure that the human element is still there. Unfortunately, the organizations that didn't have strong cultures, that didn't show appreciation, respect, kindness, and that for the employees, still don't do it. And they're the ones that are struggling the most. And so what I remind is that if you had a good culture before the pandemic, you probably still got a good culture now because you understood that what your ultimate role was, take care of your employees. Then if you take care of employees, they will work with you or they will help you to take care of your customers. The challenge is being that the customers have started to change because obviously being able to do certain things. So getting that engagement of asking your employees, how can we pivot to what our customers are telling us has been a fantastic experience for certain organizations. And honestly, they're the ones right now that I think feel quite comfortable and confident about where they're going. Now, there's still a lot of unknowns and a lot of things to be worried about. But when you've got your organization behind you as an executive, I think it's so powerful. And that's why I've always said that the smartest or the best cultures, the ones that truly drive, elevate performance, customer experience, retention, all of those things, they still had the right hearts and minds. And those organizations that took care of it have still been successful at it. What is pivoting now is how things like, how do you keep communicating? How do we do training? So all of those things is we've introduced now some more technology. I find it fascinating that if you look at the research for the last couple of years, when we have asked employees about benefits and what they like, what they don't like, what they'd like to see, the number one benefit request, particularly with younger generations, was more flex time, more working from home. Now, that was also the number one thing that many organizations resisted, particularly the ones that didn't have strong cultures. Why? Because they couldn't control what was going on. We worked with an organization that was very upset at the whole idea of now their employees are working from home, and they quickly moved to put spyware software into all the computers because they wanted to check and control how long and what people were doing on their computers because they didn't trust them. That's one of the worst things that we can see out of this is when you don't trust your employees, it's very hard to create a great culture versus those that pivoted. Suddenly employees, and again, it's very early, you would know that the research coming back says we've actually got higher productivity going on right now with people suddenly working from home, and you're seeing now companies making a stand and saying what was an option or a thought before is now actually part of how we are moving forward. So I see some positives coming out of that from a wellness and balance perspective for those companies that are able to take advantage of it, that trust and have a really strong culture.
It does come down to culture, which is rooted in values, and none of us know what our new normal will be like. But I like to say that the values we held in 2020 will be the values that will shape us as we go to 21, 22, and on beyond. So, and that's where your culture is so rich. Do you agree with that? So,
yeah, as I said, values. I funny when my book, it was funny when I was looking at all the mechanisms that really drive great cultures and great organizations. It often came back to the values of the organizations. The problem is that values for many organizations are seen as some philosophical BS, which means they're just something they put on their website, something they put on the wall. They're not actually real. Versus the companies that actually not only had cultures, but lived by their values, which means that the values, they had behaviors, they were observable, tangible, measurable. People talked about them every day. Leaders led through the values. And what you saw is that the values became a really clear, I call it the rules of the sandbox. Again, I remember when my children were younger, you'd go to the park and you'd put them in the sandbox with other kids and everybody's playing nicely. And then all of a sudden, one kid turns up and 2 seconds later, everybody's crying and toys were being thrown. And you go, gosh, I wish those parents had taught their kid the rules of the sandbox, sharing, kindness, and all of that. What we see in organizations is that the values form the rules of the sandbox. They really define how to act and interact with others. Now, when you've really ingrained those values, people come in, and I often find this, that people often say, well, younger generations, they don't listen to the rules, they don't have a strong ethic. They want to know the rules as much as anybody else. The difference is they go into an organization, they look around and say, wait up, there's no rules, there's no values, so therefore I'm going to do my values, or I'm going to act and work how I want to act. And that created the whole generational angst of millennials did this, millennials did that. We spent so much time fighting millennials and how they work. We just forgot that, hey, instead of fighting them, give them the rules of the sandbox. The new Gen Zs want the rules as much as anybody else. So the values being really rooted in an organization and have meaning in an organization, really, with all the mechanisms I looked at, I found that was one of the most critical elements that define great cultures from ones that were just thinking about having a great culture.
And what's so important, though, and you alluded to it, it's I love your organizational perspective, but what drives that, and it's the people at the top whom we call or should be our leaders, they have to exemplify it. Correct?
So true. So true. And unfortunately, some of the biggest organizational failures in the last 5 years, if you actually looked at how they acted in that moment, it was actually in complete contrast to their values. Sustainable environment, and then we had a remission scandal, where we faked the remissions in California. Our customers is our highest priority, yet we were faking bank accounts all over the place. If you actually look and you go, it was where they were in contrast. And what you've got in this very transparent world today is that we're going to call you to task on that. The organizations need to understand, if you put your values up on your website and then you do something in complete contradiction, don't complain when we call you out on it, which these organizations cry and they go, well, you said you were going to believe in this. So what are you telling us? That you don't believe in what you thought was most important? I believe values, they come from within. As an individual, you need to adhere to those values because they really define you as a person. I believe the same has to be for an organization. It's not some philosophical BS. It should come from within. It should define how you act, interact, and make decisions, and therefore be this foundation of everything that you do. And so I love that you bring it back to values, because what we found is when it came to culture, it is the first place that we start when we start to look at culture transformation and how to create a better employee experience.
It's so true. I remember having a conversation with a retired CEO who was talking about an example of a values transgression within an organization. And the company took immediate action, and the person who was a transgressor was relieved of duties ASAP. No, because it was an open and shut case. That example just radiated throughout the organization, and there was no disconnect between the top and the bottom. And
yeah, you're
culture,
so right. Yeah,
And
and again, depending on which one you're talking about, there's been a couple of great examples through the last couple of years where decisions were made so quickly. And I think what you touched on is so key. The organization were able to say, these are our values. You were transgressed against our values. It's open shut. And what I say to organizations is performance is no longer just about what you delivered, it's how you delivered. And this is where I think the big shift has started to happen. It used to be all performance-based was who sold the most, who served the most, who was most efficient. Now you've added in the how, which is where your values sort of transact. So what you're able to say is it's not just that you were the top performer and an executive, you didn't live up to how we want to perform. And therefore those decisions about letting someone go, or the most important decision today, who should join your organization, is much simpler, and it's easy, and you can be quite decisive if you believe in those values.
I am so glad you used the word how, because, coming from your world, original world of customer service and hospitality, no one does how better than hospitality. And now today, healthcare. It's all about the how. And
so true.
Yeah.
And again, I think companies need to, this company's still having to make that shift, if I can sort of make sense. I got to give you a quick sort of piece. We worked in automobile. I remember, a few years ago having this conversation with a GM. We came in, there was 20 salespeople, and we walk into the dealership, and in a car sales dealership, they put all their top performers, the top salespeople get the little plaque on the wall at some point. We went through, and for the last 2 years, it was the same guy, we'll call him Bob, was up on the wall. And I was like, wow, Bob, what a great guy. And you could talk to the general manager, and it was about Bob. Gosh, everyone should be about Bob. We interviewed all the salespeople, met with them, and the other 19 people just told us how much of a jerk Bob was. We sort of took this back to the general manager, and he was just shocked. He was like, he basically wanted to kick us out. He's like, you don't know what you're talking about. Everybody should be like Bob. It's all about Bob. Well, we left. Again, 4 months later, we got the call to come back because Bob had to get let go because Bob finally did something so outrageous that they couldn't ignore it anymore. What was fascinating was within 3 months, the sales of the total dealership had already surpassed what they were doing. 18 of the 19 other salespeople had their best numbers ever. So that just shows you it's not about what you deliver, but how. And if you allow one or two people to do how the wrong way, you're impacting the how of everybody else, the morale, the culture, more than anything else.
Well, it's a favorite topic of mine. I talk about purpose being our why, which is many folks have said it. And purpose creates our vision and our mission, which you can achieve with the Bob story in spite. And grace becomes our how. It's how you do it.
So important. And John, just to think about it more than ever before, if there was ever a time, and I know I know you've got psychic abilities at time, but there was probably never a more important time than right now than talking about grace and human kindness. And it's been one of the, you said at the beginning of, sort of this, that, people often put the soft skills to the side and think they're not meaningful. It's actually the soft skills, it's grace that's making a difference right now.
Absolutely. And I know you have us as we come to the end of our broadcast, and I ask every guest, do you have a story about grace that I know you would like to share?
I think there's so many, and it kind of ties into what's going on right now in the world around us. One of the things that very early on in, sort of the pandemic, as I sort of indicated earlier, everyone was wondering, well, what do we do? How do we do it? We sort of started to, in our consulting business, I kind of indicated, we started ensuring that as people reached out to customers, as we reached out to our own customers, we said that the most important thing is to have some curiosity. And so we sort of said everyone should lead with curiosity. And that was, as I described, ask your employees or customers just how they were doing. Then the second curious is what they missed the most about the new life and what they look forward to getting back to. And then the third part is, how can you help us get back to where it is? So asking questions. What I think is so important right now for leaders to understand is you don't know it. You don't know it all. The script was thrown out the door. Everyone that thought they knew what was going on, they're now wrong. Well, at least they're kidding themselves. So curiosity, the opposite is grandiosity. If you're grandiose right now, you're in trouble. So very early on, we said, be extremely curious. You don't know what's going on, so let's take that approach. I think the next part, and again, this is something that you're involved in, is generosity. As an organization, what we started to say is, you know what? We have a lot of our clients and customers that, they're in need. So, you know what? We're going to give them free training. We're going to give them free sessions. We went out with some curiosity. How could we help you right now? As a result of that, we said, you know what? For the next 6 months, we're going to be very generous in our approach, which means, again, it wasn't about getting paid for business. Nobody was getting paid. But what we did is, as I said, we were still doing business, even though we were doing these live training sessions virtually for free. We started to send content out to the world, connected with different schools and said, hey, what do you want? How can we help you? What I think is most important is, started with curiosity, then with generosity. We were able to sort of, one, keep busy and keep thinking through this process. But more importantly, now, because we kept everyone engaged, we've now got our customers coming back to us and saying, hey, you know what you did for us back then? Gosh, we got a little bit of budget. Hey, we're thinking about 2021. So we're seeing that process actually come to fruition and have benefits. And I just think it's a process that I talk a lot about because any organization can adopt it. Be curious, be generous, and then you can stay in business.
I love that. That's great. Shane, you've been a terrific guest. How can people find you? Shane Green?
Well, they have to come to New Zealand right now. And unfortunately, unless you're a New Zealander, we're not letting you into through the door. But virtually, you can find me at shanegreen.com. As I sort of said, that's where I reside, or sgeinternational.com, which is our training business. But you can find us. If you know where John Baldoni is, you'll find me as well, because we're LinkedIn everywhere. But again, one of the things is we're still being very curious and generous. We'd love to know how you're doing. And if we can help in any way, obviously reach out. John, what you're doing is just fantastic as always, and sort of living the example of what grace is all about.
Well, thank you. It's kind of you to join us. You've been a terrific guest. And with that, I will say goodbye, or good day to you tomorrow.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers.